Historically, licensing has been easy to measure. When installed on physical machines, software usage is easy to keep track of because the licenses exist in a very tangible sense. The one-to-one relationship between host and license means the commercial models and the auditing methods used to verify them are relatively straightforward. As with so much, the cloud has radically changed things. Many existing license agreements for legacy or on-premise applications cannot easily be transferred to cloud-based environments. With virtualization and cloud infrastructures potentially enabling a one-to-many relationship between host and license, software vendors are tasked with answering the question, how do you account for the flexibility and elasticity of cloud with a fixed license model? This question has created a crisis of standardization amongst service providers as they translate existing legacy licensing schemes into effective cloud-ready equivalents. As a result, licensing types have evolved from standard product-focused machine-based licenses to now include more service-focused or pay-per-use options. Here are some examples, and you can see that the trend is very much towards the service-based, per-user or consumption-based license type. Now this may seem straightforward, but these changes come with lots of challenges, including complexity, a lack of standards, legacy licensing transfer rights, multi-layered environments and hybrid environments, to name just a few. A good way to approach the challenge of licensing compliance in the cloud is to break down the task into distinct parts. Application and service assessment. As part of your cloud migration planning, you'll need to include licensing in your application assessment process, plus identify any existing cloud services in use. Licensing in the cloud. For software identified as part of any new cloud environments, an understanding of how these licensing agreements work in relation to different cloud models. Mapping requirements. Armed with this knowledge and a more defined cloud vision, you should map license requirements post-migration. Defining responsibility. Coupled with this, it's important to identify the boundaries of responsibility between you, your providers, and indeed partners for software licensing across any new cloud environments. Asset lifecycle management. And finally, and more importantly, how existing software asset management processes and tools work today, and how and if they can work with new cloud environments. Cloud environments can be challenging for license compliance, as the abstraction of resources from hardware produces a layer of complexity between the provision of software and its visibility to the provider. This is compounded by the fact that there are several different points during the provision of infrastructure at which you could purchase licenses for the software installed on it. A major part of addressing this challenge comes down to understanding usage rights, transfer rights, etc., and knowing where the borders of responsibility lie. And the best place to start is with a full software audit. Application assessment is covered in more detail in Module 4, but specifically with licensing, you should interrogate your application estate with a focus on which licenses are associated with which applications, including the operating systems and any other applications that they are interdependent with. For applications that are targeted for cloud migration, conduct a more thorough review, including termination date and, if subscription-based, any penalties associated with early termination, costs and all available licensing models, platform, device or any other transfer rights that might exist, cloud license models that are on offer from suppliers, whether there are any SaaS versions of the applications with considerations for costs and migration options and upgrade paths, etc., and implicit versus explicit rights associated with your current contracts. Similarly, understanding what existing cloud services are already in use, whether sanctioned or not, is an important step in the process. Sometimes, for example, cloud services are being used even if you have existing perpetual licensing rights for the same software. Perhaps this is due to version access or device access or even straightforward ease of use. Also, look to understand these services and the limitations on users, whether that's limitations on device access, locations, etc. This includes looking to understand general costs and the commercial models on offer from these suppliers, as well as contractual terms, limitations, SLAs, and support. Also, try and get an accurate picture of who uses these services and to what extent. This may actually be quite difficult via traditional SAM tools or processes, as they may not be able to identify and audit usage. However, talk to the service providers and request management reports where available. And lastly, existing cloud services may actually be integrated into wider business processes or even connected to on-premise or even other cloud services via APIs. It's important to understand these relationships and how they might impact on license or contractual compliance. Scalability, flexibility, and elasticity are central tenets of cloud computing across all the different cloud models. And software licensing is where we can see them clearly at work, if only for the complexity it creates. And it's that flexibility and the abstraction of systems from hardware that creates such a challenge. So instead, software vendors have developed new ways of charging for their products in the cloud. However, due to a lack of cloud licensing standards and a myriad of potential cloud scenarios, the new cloud licensing schemes and associated rules are complicated and diverse. So the first challenge is to understand these new schemes. Also, cloud flexibility and easy scalability can lead to over-provisioning or under-licensing. Existing management tools may not be suitable to track these new licensing metrics like user or device access or resource consumption. And traditional IT asset management and IT service management may need to move in step with the speed cloud can deliver change. The problem is there is no common approach defined for licensing in the cloud. So instead, vendors now charge according to different criteria. Some base costs according to the amount of concurrent users, others measure the instances according to the number of CPU cores in use. Indeed, some vendors make no distinction between virtualized instances and physical boxes, treating every VM as a host. And things get more complicated when physical desktops start accessing virtualized copies of applications, or indeed their own copies licensed to that specific machine. Both shortages and overlap occur regularly. Again, there are no hard and fast rules. The important thing is to get clarification from the license provider prior to planning and deployment. When looking at the different cloud models, license compliance risk is relatively low for software as a service, while the risk of software overspend is relatively high due to the ease of provisioning and potential lack of centralized control. Conversely, compliance risk is actually quite high for infrastructure as a service, and risk of overspend is moderate. It's worth adding that when it comes to infrastructure as a service, it's not just the risk of software overspend that you have to worry about, but also the infrastructure or VMs associated with the platform. You can easily overbuy reserved or on-demand instances from Amazon Web Services, for example, if you aren't tracking and actively managing these services. While each vendor cloud licensing scheme is unique to their products and priorities, there are some common metrics used in these schemes. These fall into 4 groups. Click on each of the headings to see some examples of the metrics used in typical cloud licensing programs. While these are common cloud metrics, the way they are incorporated and measured in vendor licensing agreements varies considerably. Some base costs according to the amount of concurrent users, others measure the instances according to the number of CPU cores in use. Indeed, some vendors make no distinction between virtualized instances and physical boxes, treating every VM as a host. Further complications arise when migrating aspects of your environment to cloud-based infrastructure. Remaining conscious of the borders of licensing responsibility can be challenging when your environment becomes split between outsourced services and internally delivered systems. Even lifting and shifting to an environment into apparently identical cloud infrastructure will require a licensing review. Once you have identified how these cloud schemes work, you should look to track existing usage against these same metrics. There are third-party tools and organizations that can help you achieve this. So what are the most common scenarios that prompt licensing queries when moving to infrastructure as a service or platform as a service? Well, based on the research and feedback from the industry, here are some of the most common licensing queries that come up during cloud migration projects. Firstly, how to ensure development environments are licensed as efficiently as possible and how bring your own license can be accommodated. Or how to efficiently license for virtual desktop projects based on either a per user or per desktop basis. How to assess database server options and decide if core or server/CAL based licensing is best suited to your plans. And how to minimize the need for duplicate licensing in DR and business continuity solutions. Or the best balance of flexibility and compliance for cloud-based corporate applications. Or efficient backup and archiving licensing. And finally, how to decipher the SPLA or Service Provider License Agreement program, assessing if it's relevant for your solution, how to buy it, and how to manage it. Typically, there are four main ways to implement software licensing when using a cloud provider's platform. The simplest is letting the provider purchase and manage the relevant software. This way, they are responsible for license compliance and contractual terms. That said, it's important to double-check roles and responsibilities and not make any assumptions. Alternatively, if the terms of the license allow it, you can transfer software licenses to the cloud provider and then negotiate adequate compensation terms. In some cases, licenses can be used as they are, and the terms of the license cover usage in a new cloud environment. However, this option can pose a risk, as license agreements with open terms or multiple use rights can be open to interpretation from both the customer and the vendor, and this ambiguity can result in unexpected compliance shortcomings. And lastly, many vendors offer a direct upgrade or conversion scheme that enables on-premise licenses to be converted to the appropriate cloud-based versions. We'll cover an example of this next. Microsoft offers a range of additional flexibility benefits under a scheme called Software Assurance, which can be purchased along with volume licensing agreements. Microsoft's license mobility comes as part of Software Assurance and enables you to deploy certain server application licenses purchased under volume licensing agreements onto a Microsoft authorized cloud service provider's platform. This means that you can use these licenses for both on-premise and cloud configurations. However, there are some complexities that accompany this type of license conversion. For example, only certain applications are covered by this scheme, and there are also rules around server assignment. So it's worth getting professional advice to ensure appropriate solution design and compliance management. Once you have a good handle on your current application and license estate, and you have identified how the alternative or cloud-based licenses work, the next step is to map your license requirements versus your destination. The key here is to apply the new metrics associated with the new cloud licensing schemes to your current or projected application usage, whether that's the number of users or resources or consumption patterns or whatever that might be. This will give you a reasonable forecast of the license requirements and costs, but also enable your IT asset management or SAM teams to incorporate these new metrics and compliance terms into their processes. There aren't many hard and fast rules when defining licensing responsibility in the cloud. The onus varies dramatically between providers, vendors, delivery models, and internal configurations. For instance, where third-party suppliers are involved, ask questions around who is responsible for licensing the individual components and confirming the configurations are still supported and maintained by the vendors. Consider factors like virtualization layers, orchestration layers, operating systems, and individual applications. Furthermore, if the design includes any open source components, consider if they're supported, what the terms are, and by whom. Do you fully know where open source code is being used across your organization and the conditions under which the code is open? During the application assessment phase, try and use a service or toolset that includes provision for open source. It's a balancing act between the provider and customer. Often, providers are more open to negotiation than may seem apparent. Don't be afraid to offer a counter-proposal if you can leverage projected growth against current costs, for example. Effective software asset management is about controlling risk and the complexity of software assets and their associated costs. It's also about optimizing your estate to ensure you get the most out of your software spend. It relates to a wide set of factors that cumulatively ensure that the organization's software portfolio stays aligned to business need. This task has become more and more complex and challenging as technology evolves at an exponential rate. Initially, cloud was seen as potentially making life easier, as paying for what you use promised the end of license compliance issues. Sadly, this is not entirely the case, and in fact, in many cases, cloud has introduced new layers of complexity. For example, due to a lack of common licensing models or standards, the variety of schemes on offer has created a lot more complexity. Now that line of business departments are involved in the provisioning or even managing some cloud services, the risk of SaaS sprawl and uncontrolled and inefficient spend has increased. And this, coupled with a myriad of microservices and hybrid environments with disparate cost models, makes centralizing spend analysis a real challenge. And in fact, proactive cost analysis is one of the things most needed in modern IT departments, as service managers come under more and more pressure on spend. Another of the challenges relates to the effectiveness of some of the SAM tools on offer and their ability to keep up with the new demands of complex cloud environments. In fact, SAM practices may need to adapt, as traditional discovery and reconcile cycles are not suitable to the ultra-flexible cloud environments. And some vendor cloud licensing programs are not clear enough, which can lead to ambiguity and compliance risks. The first step in addressing these issues is recognizing these traits in your own migration projects, and then changing your SAM processes and practices to mitigate these risks in advance. If anything, increased investment and focus on IT and software asset management is well worth considering during and after migration to cloud. In more general terms, there are significant parallels between the management of software assets and licenses and the management of third-party cloud-based services, particularly regarding compliance, risk, cost and value, SAM's core objectives. Click on the icons to find out more. Lifecycle perspective. As with software assets, Life cycle phases of cloud-based services need to be considered as part of the original evaluation, justification, and contracting phases. This includes procurement, implementation, ongoing management, and termination. This may involve consultation with functions across the organisation based on their role in the life cycle. Integrated view. The organisation needs an inventory of the cloud-based services to which it has committed, and over what period, the total cost, the terms under which the service is provided and terminated, and the associated obligations and risks. As with software assets, this requires a clear view of how these services integrate with business process, any other software assets or indeed services, and the financial and contractual aspects of the service itself. Contract compliance. As with licensing agreements, agreements for cloud-based services have grants and restrictions on use, as well as penalties for non-compliance. Access and usage needs to be monitored to ensure compliance by the organisation and also compliance by the cloud service provider in providing the service itself. Corresponding policies may need to be established, for example, prohibiting sharing of user IDs. License transfer. If the software license is to be held by the cloud service provider, the organisation's existing license agreement needs to be reviewed because it may not allow the transfer or the transfer terms may be prohibitive. Additionally, the organisation needs to ensure that the cloud service provider is sufficiently licensed for its business model and is using genuine software. License compliance. If the software license is held by the organisation, it is essential to know and have some control over whether software is installed and who has access and for what purpose, both at an organisational level and at a cloud service personnel level. A cloud service provider hardware change, upgrade, replacement or relocation, for example, could result in non-compliance with the license agreement, as could other aspects of the cloud service provider's operations, for example, disaster recovery provisions. Cost management. Identifying and tracking all material costs and comparing to usage and value, ensuring that the organisation is not paying for unused or low-value services. Working in closer partnership with service managers and line of business departments to provide a more proactive cost analysis. Vendor management. As with any candidate vendor, the cloud service provider's business model, terms and overall viability needs to be considered in selecting cloud-based partnerships and re-evaluated on a periodic basis throughout the relationship. While many of the principles associated with software asset management are still valid, and in some cases more important in cloud environments, there are certain practices where change would be beneficial. For example, a change in practice and mindset to enable a constant compliance approach to SAM as opposed to periodic assess and reconcile cycles. Considering that development environments, for example, can be provisioned, used and decommissioned over a very short space of time, or other highly flexible aspects of cloud can create non-compliance blips. This requires SAM teams to change their working practices and the tools that they use to effectively manage these new dynamic systems. Having a proactive and forward-thinking and collaborative approach with service management teams, and indeed line of business teams, will help make the job a lot easier. All of this flexibility, agility, and complexity actually provides a greater range of variables with which to negotiate. Look to leverage the difficulties in tracking and complexities involved in cloud environments to your advantage and push for flexibility in arrangements where you can. In summary, cloud has disrupted software licensing just as much as it has innovated service delivery and resource consumption. As the number of stakeholders increases, clear and ongoing communication is essential. Establish the boundaries of responsibility with your vendors and providers early on in the cycle, and don't be afraid to negotiate the terms of the contracts. Investigate how different providers charge for discrete resources and make a decision that aligns with your financial objectives and existing infrastructure spend. And finally, review your software estate regularly and include a licensing audit as a matter of good hygiene.